A racist cop, Mark Harrington, drags black woman Leslie out of her car for an unacceptable reason. But 4 minutes later, his world takes a turn, and he faces a brutal revenge that leaves him speechless. What truth awaits Mark, and will he be able to handle it? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Mark Harrington sat rigidly in his patrol car, his stern gaze scanning the streets of downtown as darkness settled over the city. The dashboard clock read 4:45 p.m., and he'd already issued 4 citations. Some might call him harsh, but in his mind, rules were rules. He spotted a teenager skateboarding on the sidewalk, weaving between pedestrians. Mark's jaw tightened as he pulled over and stepped out of his vehicle. "Hey, stop right there," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd cultivated over 15 years on the force. The kid, no more than 14, froze. "But I'm just—" "No excuses," Mark cut him off, already pulling out his citation book. "Skateboarding on public sidewalks is prohibited. That's a $50 fine." The teenager's eyes welled up, but Mark ignored it. Tears were just manipulation, he thought. He'd seen too many people try to cry their way out of tickets. Later that evening, Mark pulled into the station's parking lot for his break. His colleague, Officer Sarah Chen, was heading to her car. "Hey Mark, you coming to the new empathy training session tomorrow?" she asked, adjusting her gear bag. Mark let out a derisive snort. "Waste of time if you ask me. Been doing this job just fine without all that touchy-feely nonsense." Sarah shook her head. "The world's changing, Mark. Maybe we should too." "The world's getting soft, that's what's changing," he replied, his voice hard. "You start letting emotions cloud your judgment, and next thing you know, nobody respects the law anymore. Rules are rules." "There's a difference between being fair and being rigid," Sarah suggested gently. "Been hearing that a lot lately," Mark grumbled, thinking about the recent department memo about mandatory sensitivity training. 20 years on the force, and suddenly they think we need to learn how to connect with people. Back in my day, when an officer gave an order, people listened. No questions asked. Sarah opened her car door but paused. "Maybe that's exactly why we need this training, Mark." He waved her off dismissively and headed inside, his boots echoing against the pavement. In his mind, he was one of the last real cops left, someone who understood that authority meant something. All this talk about empathy and understanding was just another sign that the world was going soft, and he wanted no part of it. The next morning brought another routine patrol for Mark. The spring sun beat down on his cruiser as he monitored traffic on Cedar Avenue, one of the city's more affluent streets lined with boutiques and coffee shops. His radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, we've got a report of a suspicious vehicle in your area, black Mercedes sedan heading north on Cedar." "Copy that," Mark responded, straightening in his seat. "I'm on it." Within minutes, he spotted a black Mercedes that matched the description. The car was pristine, its chrome trim gleaming in the sunlight. Mark flipped on his lights and sirens, and the Mercedes pulled over smoothly into a nearby parking spot. Through his windshield, he could see the driver, a black woman in casual attire. She sat perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel just as the law required. Mark approached the vehicle, his hand resting near his belt out of habit. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded without preamble. The woman turned slightly, her expression calm but puzzled. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like when people questioned his authority. "Ma'am, I said step out of the vehicle." "I understand, officer," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "But I believe I have the right to know why I'm being stopped. I was following all traffic laws." "Ma'am," Mark's voice grew harder, his patience wearing thin. "I won't ask again. Exit the vehicle now." "My name is Leslie," she said, maintaining her composure despite Mark's growing irritation. "And I'm happy to comply. But I'd like to understand what prompted this stop." Mark felt his face grow hot. Who did this woman think she was, demanding explanations? In his experience, people who asked too many questions were usually hiding something. "Listen here." "I'm listening, officer." Leslie interrupted softly, her hand still visible on the wheel. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." This quiet challenge to his authority made Mark's blood pressure rise. He wasn't used to this kind of response, not defensive or aggressive, but calmly insistent on her rights. It threw him off balance, making him even more irritated. "Step out of the car immediately," he barked, his hand now firmly gripping his belt. "This is your final warning." Mark's patience snapped. In one swift motion, he yanked open the car door and grabbed Leslie's arm. "That's it. You're under arrest for failing to comply with an officer's orders." "Officer, please," Leslie started, but Mark was already pulling her from the vehicle. Despite his rough handling, she didn't resist. He spun her around and cuffed her hands behind her back, the metal clicking loudly in the morning air. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Mark heard gasps and murmurs of disapproval. Through the corner of his eye, he saw phones being raised, their cameras pointed directly at him. A woman in a business suit shook her head in disgust. An elderly man muttered, "This isn't right." "Everyone stay back!" Mark shouted, his voice carrying more edge than he intended. The growing audience only made him more defensive, more determined to show his authority. Leslie stood quietly, her dignity intact despite the handcuffs. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Mark's agitation. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes with a gaze that held no anger, only a deep sadness. "I hope you see what you're doing someday," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but somehow cutting through all the background noise. Mark scoffed, trying to dismiss her words. "Save it for the judge," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The weight of the onlookers' stares pressed down on him, making his collar feel too tight. He could hear their disapproving whispers, see their phones recording every moment of his actions. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down. He couldn't show weakness, couldn't admit that maybe, just maybe, he'd overreacted. Instead, he tightened his grip on Leslie's arm, maintaining the stern expression he'd perfected over years of service. The crowd had grown larger now, their collective disapproval hanging heavy in the air. Some were shaking their heads, others were making phone calls, probably to the police department or local news stations. But Mark forced himself to ignore them all, focusing instead on following procedure, on maintaining the illusion of control. The radio on Mark's shoulder crackled to life. "Officer Harrington, this is Chief Ramirez. Release the woman immediately. I'm 2 blocks away." Mark's stomach dropped. The chief's voice was cold and sharp, carrying none of its usual warmth. He stood frozen, still gripping Leslie's arm, as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Chief Ramirez stepped out, his face set in hard lines. "Release her now, officer," Chief Ramirez commanded, striding toward them. His presence seemed to fill the entire street. Mark's fingers fumbled with the handcuff keys, his face burning hot with shame. As he removed the cuffs, his hands trembled slightly. Leslie rubbed her wrists gently, but said nothing. "Ma'am," Chief Ramirez addressed Leslie, his tone completely different, respectful and apologetic. "On behalf of our department, I deeply apologize for this incident. You're free to go." Leslie straightened her jacket and smoothed her hair. The crowd had grown even larger, and now they began to clap and cheer as she walked back to her car. She held her head high, her dignity intact despite everything that had happened. "That's right," someone shouted from the crowd. "Show them what grace looks like." Mark stood rigid, his chest tight with humiliation. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, hear the whispers and comments from the onlookers. The phones were still recording, capturing every second of his public disgrace. "We see you, sister!" another voice called out as Leslie opened her car door. She paused for a moment, offering a small wave to the supportive crowd before sliding into the driver's seat. Chief Ramirez watched her drive away, then turned to Mark. His expression was thunderous, his disappointment evident in every line of his face. Mark wanted to defend himself, to explain his actions, but the words died in his throat. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd been doing, began to settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The crowd's cheers followed Leslie's car as it disappeared around the corner, leaving Mark to face the consequences of his actions under the harsh morning sun and his chief's stern gaze. Back at the precinct, Mark sat rigid in his chair as Chief Ramirez stood before the assembled officers in the briefing room. The fluorescent lights seemed unusually harsh, highlighting every disappointed face around him. "What happened today is exactly the kind of behavior that destroys public trust," Chief Ramirez announced, his voice carrying across the silent room. Officer Harrington's actions were not just unprofessional, they were discriminatory and dangerous. Mark's jaw clenched. He could feel his colleagues' stares burning into him, some shocked, others disgusted. Officer Chen, who usually sat next to him during briefings, had chosen a seat across the room. "This department has worked hard to build relationships with our community," Ramirez continued, placing both hands on the podium. "Years of effort can be undone in minutes by this kind of conduct. The video is already spreading online." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Mark's face grew hot, and his collar felt too tight. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear from all the judgmental eyes around him. "Officer Harrington," Chief Ramirez said, fixing him with a stern look. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation of this incident. Badge and gun on my desk before you leave." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. Suspension. Investigation. His stomach churned as panic began to rise in his chest. Everything he'd worked for, his career, his reputation, seemed to be crumbling around him. "This isn't just about one traffic stop," Ramirez addressed the room again. "This is about who we are as officers and what we stand for. I won't tolerate any behavior that undermines our duty to protect and serve all members of our community." Mark's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of his chair. Anger and fear warred inside him. Anger at being publicly dressed down, fear of losing the job that defined him. The weight of his badge, which had always felt like a source of pride, now seemed to burn against his chest. As the other officers filed out of the briefing room, no one met his eyes. The isolation felt suffocating, and for the first time, Mark began to understand just how badly he had miscalculated. His world, once so certain and ordered, had been upended in the space of a single morning. The next morning, Mark sat in Chief Ramirez's office, his shoulders stiff and his expression guarded. The chief slid a folder across his desk. "There's a way back from this, Harrington," Ramirez said, his tone softer than yesterday but still firm. "The department has a new empathy training program. Complete it successfully, and we'll reassess your situation." Mark's fingers tightened on the armrest of his chair. Empathy training? The words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Chief, with all due respect—" "This isn't a request," Ramirez cut in. "It's your only option if you want to keep your badge." Mark opened the folder, scanning the first page. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the program facilitator's name. Leslie Williams. The same woman he'd wrongfully detained. The same woman who had looked him in the eye and hoped he'd see what he was doing someday. "This has to be a joke," Mark muttered, his face growing hot. "Ms. Leslie Williams is a highly respected community leader," Ramirez explained. "She's been running these programs for 3 years with remarkable success. Several departments have partnered with her." Mark's stomach churned. The thought of sitting in a room with her, having to listen to her, made him want to quit on the spot. But the weight of his 20-year career pressed down on him. His pension, his identity, everything he'd worked for, it all hung in the balance. "The program starts next week," Ramirez continued. 3 months, twice weekly sessions. Ms. Williams has agreed to take you on, despite what happened. The chief's words made Mark's jaw clench. Despite what happened. As if he needed her forgiveness. As if she was doing him a favor. "And if I refuse?" Mark asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we proceed with suspension," Ramirez replied simply. "Your choice, Harrington." Mark stared at the folder in his hands, feeling trapped. The woman he'd humiliated would now hold power over his future. The irony wasn't lost on him, and it made his blood boil. But beneath the anger, fear crept in. Fear of losing everything he'd built. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll do it." Ramirez nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Remember, this isn't just about checking boxes, Harrington. Real change is needed here. Ms. Williams will be reporting directly to me about your progress." Mark stood up, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. His world had shrunk to this impossible choice: swallow his pride and face Leslie again, or lose his career. Either way, it felt like punishment. Either way, it felt like losing. Next week after, Mark slouched in his metal folding chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The community center's meeting room felt too small, too warm, and far too diverse for his comfort. Around him sat a mix of people, some in business suits, others in casual wear, and even a couple of fellow officers he recognized. His eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding contact with anyone, especially Leslie. She stood at the front of the room, dressed in a simple blue cardigan and black slacks, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Welcome, everyone," Leslie's voice carried through the room, warm and steady. "I believe in starting these sessions by sharing our stories. They shape who we are, and understanding them helps us understand each other." Mark shifted uncomfortably, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. He didn't want to hear her story, didn't want to think of her as anything more than the woman who'd caused his suspension. "I grew up on the South Side," Leslie began, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "My father worked 3 jobs to put me through college. He taught me to hold my head high, even when others tried to make me feel small." Despite himself, Mark found his gaze drawn to her face. There was no anger there, no bitterness, just a quiet strength that made him uneasy. "The first time I was pulled over for no reason, I was 16, she continued. "My father had just bought me my first car, an old Honda he'd saved up for. The officer made me sit on the curb for an hour while he searched the vehicle. My father found me there crying." Mark's chest tightened. He thought of his own daughter, just turned 15, eager to start driving lessons. "But my father didn't teach me to hate. He said, 'Baby, some people see what they expect to see. Your job isn't to prove them wrong. It's to know your own worth.'" Leslie's voice softened. "That lesson saved me from becoming bitter. It taught me that change doesn't come from fighting hate with hate, but from helping people see beyond their expectations." Mark uncrossed his arms slowly, his prepared defenses crumbling against her genuine vulnerability. He'd expected accusations, anger, maybe even public humiliation. Instead, he found himself face to face with something far more challenging, a story that made her human. "I've been pulled over 17 times in my life," Leslie said, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room, including Mark's. "Each time, I remembered my father's words. Each time, I chose to believe that understanding could bridge the gap between fear and trust." Mark felt exposed, as if Leslie's calm words had stripped away his protective armor. He'd been ready for a fight, but how could he fight against someone who refused to see him as an enemy? As the session goes on, one by one, participants began sharing their stories. A middle-aged Asian woman spoke about being told to go back to her country, despite being born in America. A young Latino businessman described being followed around stores while wearing expensive suits. Each story landed like a heavy stone in Mark's stomach. He shifted in his chair, jaw clenched. These people were successful, educated, not the troublemakers he'd been trained to watch for. A black teenager in a school uniform talked about being stopped 3 times in 1 week walking home from basketball practice. Mark recognized the street. It was on his own patrol route. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, but his words lacked their usual conviction. A fellow officer, Rodriguez, spoke next. "I used to think like some of you," he said, glancing at Mark. "Thought people were just making excuses. Then my own nephew got roughed up by cops while walking in his own neighborhood. Made me see things different." Mark's face burned. He could feel Leslie watching him, her gaze steady and knowing. The stories kept coming, each one chipping away at the walls he'd built around his beliefs. Finally, Leslie stepped forward again. "Officer Harrington," she said softly, addressing him directly for the first time since their encounter. The room fell silent. "I see you struggling with what you're hearing today." Mark's hands gripped his knees tightly. He wanted to leave, to dismiss all of this as propaganda, but something in Leslie's voice held him there. "These stories aren't meant to shame you," she continued. "They're invitations to see the world through different eyes. Can you try, just for a moment, to imagine how it feels to be viewed as a threat before you've spoken a single word? Her question hung in the air. Mark remembered the look in Leslie's eyes when he'd pulled her from her car. Not fear or anger, but a deep, tired knowledge, as if she'd been through it all before. "You don't have to speak today," Leslie said gently. "Just listen. Really listen. Not to defend, not to argue, but to understand. That's where change begins." Mark sat back in his chair, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. For the first time, he allowed himself to really hear the pain in these stories, to see the humanity in each face. It left him feeling adrift, questioning things he'd always taken as absolute truth. Mark's apartment felt emptier than usual that evening. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter with more force than necessary, the metallic clang echoing through the quiet space. His uniform felt heavy on his shoulders, each badge and insignia a reminder of the authority he'd always worn with pride. "I was just doing my job," he muttered to himself, opening his refrigerator and staring blankly at its contents. The words sounded hollow now, even to his own ears. He grabbed a cold beer and sank into his worn leather recliner, the one piece of furniture he'd kept after his divorce 3 years ago. The faces from the session flashed through his mind. The teenager walking home from basketball, Rodriguez's nephew, the businessman in his expensive suit, and Leslie's eyes, filled with that knowing patience that made his chest tight. "They don't understand what we deal with," he said to the empty room. "The split-second decisions, the risks." But even as he spoke, new thoughts intruded. How many times had he pulled over vehicles for being suspicious? How many of those drivers had looked like Leslie? Mark took a long drink, trying to drown out the doubts. On his coffee table lay a stack of complaint forms he'd accumulated over the years. He'd always dismissed them as people trying to avoid consequences for their actions. Now he found himself picking them up, reading them with new eyes. Subject displayed aggressive behavior, he read from one form. Had they really been aggressive? Or just frustrated, scared, tired of being stopped for no reason? Like Leslie had been. His phone buzzed, a text from Rodriguez. "You okay, man? That session was pretty intense." Mark ignored it. He wasn't ready to talk, wasn't ready to admit that the solid ground of his convictions felt increasingly shaky. 20 years on the force, and he'd never questioned his methods. It had always been simple. Enforce the law, maintain order, protect and serve. But whose order? Protect and serve whom? The questions made his head hurt. He got up and paced his apartment, past the wall of commendations he'd earned over the years. Awards for valor, for dedication to duty. He'd earned every one of them, hadn't he? Or had he just been lucky that none of his split-second decisions had ended tragically? "I'm not a bad cop," he whispered, but the words stuck in his throat. The memory of Leslie's calm dignity as he'd handcuffed her made his stomach turn. She hadn't been a threat. She'd never been a threat. And deep down, he'd known it even then. The community center's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mark settled into his usual chair at the back of the room. He'd chosen the spot carefully, close to the exit, away from others. Today, there were 12 people in attendance, more than the first session. A middle-aged man named Thomas stood up when Leslie invited sharing. He wore a crisp business suit and carried himself with quiet dignity. 25 years ago, Thomas began, his voice steady but weighted with memory. "I was driving my son to his college interview. Brand new suit, straight-A student, full ride waiting for him at Princeton." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together. "We never made it there. An officer decided my Mercedes didn't belong in that neighborhood." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Thomas described being forced to lie face down on the pavement while his son watched, helpless. The boy's new suit had been ruined, and they'd missed the interview. "My son never got over it," Thomas said quietly. "He gave up on Princeton. Gave up on a lot of dreams that day. He couldn't trust authority anymore. Couldn't trust the system. Now he works at my company. Never leaves our neighborhood if he can help it." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. How many times had he pulled over suspicious vehicles? How many dreams had he interrupted, or worse, destroyed? That officer probably went home thinking he'd done his job, Thomas continued, looking directly at Mark. But he changed our lives forever. Mark felt his jaw tighten, his old defenses rising. But beneath them, a new feeling stirred, a sickening recognition. He remembered a similar stop just last month. A young man in a nice car headed to a job interview. Mark had kept him for 45 minutes, certain something was wrong despite finding nothing suspicious. "Would you like to share your thoughts, Officer Harrington?" Leslie's gentle voice cut through his reflection. Mark started, his throat dry. "I'm just doing my—" The familiar justification died on his lips as Thomas's story echoed in his mind. His hands clenched into fists on his knees as conflicting emotions warred inside him. Everything he'd believed about good policing, about maintaining order, seemed to crack and shift beneath the weight of these stories. "It's not that simple anymore, is it?" Leslie asked softly. Mark shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. The certainty that had guided his entire career was crumbling, and he didn't know what would be left in its place. During the break, Mark found himself pacing in the hallway outside the meeting room. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't get enough air. When Leslie stepped out to refill her water bottle, he couldn't stop himself from approaching her. "These stories," he said, his voice gruff with tension. "How do we know they're all true? People tend to exaggerate, make things sound worse than they are." Leslie turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Like the way I exaggerated when you pulled me over, Officer Harrington." Mark flinched at the memory but pressed on. "Look, in my experience, being tough is what keeps order. All this—" He gestured vaguely at the meeting room. "This softness just makes people weak." "Weak?" Leslie's smile was gentle but knowing. "Let me tell you about weakness and strength, Mark. When I was 16, an officer stopped me while I was walking home from the library. He said I matched the description of someone who'd stolen from a nearby store. I showed him my library card, my student ID, even my checked-out books. But he still made me sit on the curb for 2 hours while he verified my story." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I could have gotten angry, could have let that experience fill me with hate. Instead, I chose to channel it into helping others. I went to law school, started community programs, and now I'm here trying to build bridges with the very people who once made me feel powerless. Tell me, Officer Harrington, does that sound weak to you?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. His usual defenses felt hollow in the face of her quiet strength. "The truly weak response," Leslie continued, "is refusing to examine our own actions because we're afraid of what we might find. It takes incredible strength to admit we might be wrong, to open ourselves to change." Her words struck something deep inside Mark, making his carefully constructed walls tremble. He thought about how many times he'd dismissed complaints, ignored pleas for understanding, all while telling himself he was being strong. He started, his voice unusually uncertain. "I don't know how to do this job any other way." "That's why we're here," Leslie replied softly. "Not to tear you down, but to show you there's a better way to be strong." The sun was setting as Mark drove home from the empathy session, casting long shadows across the street. His mind kept replaying Leslie's words about strength and weakness, making his usual certainties feel less solid with each passing moment. At a quiet intersection, movement caught his eye. A small boy, no more than 7 or 8, stood at the crosswalk, shifting from foot to foot. The child kept looking both ways, clutching his backpack straps, but seemed too nervous to step out onto the street. Mark found himself slowing down without really thinking about it. He pulled over, parking his car properly. Old habits died hard, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. "Hey there, buddy," he called out, keeping his voice gentle in a way that surprised even himself. "Need some help crossing?" The boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "My mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers." "That's smart of your mom," Mark replied, and for the first time in weeks he felt a genuine smile cross his face. "I'm Officer Harrington, see my badge?" He pointed to the shield still pinned to his belt. The boy's face lit up. "A real police officer?" "That's right. Would you like me to help you cross?" The child nodded eagerly and Mark held out his hand. Together, they waited for the light to change, then walked across the street. The boy's small hand felt warm and trusting in his own, and something shifted inside Mark's chest. "Thank you, officer," the boy called out as he hurried away toward a row of houses. Mark stood there for a moment, watching him go. The simple act of helping someone, no authority, no force, just kindness, had felt good, natural even. He thought about how the boy had trusted him once he knew Mark was a police officer. Wasn't that the real power of the badge? Not to intimidate or control, but to help people feel safe? Back in his car, Mark sat quietly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He'd always thought being an effective officer meant maintaining strict control, showing no weakness. But helping that child cross the street hadn't made him feel weak at all. If anything, it had made him feel more worthy of the badge he wore. Maybe, he thought, this was what Leslie had been trying to tell him. Perhaps true authority didn't come from forcing people to comply, but from earning their trust and respect through understanding and compassion. Next day, Mark sat in the precinct's break room, picking at his sandwich while his colleagues gathered around the table for lunch. The familiar banter filled the air, but today it felt different. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. Officer Thompson leaned back in his chair, gesturing with his coffee cup. "You should have seen this guy I pulled over yesterday. Fancy car, acting all entitled. You know the type." Several officers nodded knowingly, and Mark felt his stomach tighten. He'd used those same words before, made those same assumptions. "Yeah, they always think they're above the law," Officer Chen chimed in. "Like that woman last week. Designer purse, attitude and all." Mark's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He thought of Leslie, her quiet dignity, the way she'd handled herself during their encounter. He'd made assumptions about her too, hadn't he? Just like his colleagues were doing now. "You're awful quiet today, Harrington," Thompson noted, raising an eyebrow. "That sensitivity training getting to you?" Mark shrugged, not meeting their eyes. "Just tired," he mumbled, but inside his mind was racing. The casual way they dismissed entire groups of people, the automatic assumptions, he recognized it all because he'd been part of it for so long. "Speaking of which," Chen continued, "did you hear about Martinez? Had to let someone go because they played the race card. It's getting ridiculous out there." The others grumbled in agreement, but Mark found himself wondering about Martinez's story. What had really happened? A week ago, he would have joined in without hesitation. But now, he watched his colleagues laugh and joke, their words carrying weight he'd never noticed before. These were good officers, he thought. Good people, just like he'd always considered himself a good officer. But listening to them now, he could hear the echoes of prejudice in their words, the same prejudice that had led to his own suspension. Mark pushed his half-eaten lunch away, his appetite gone. The break room suddenly felt too small, too confined. The easy certainty he'd once shared with his fellow officers had been replaced by an uncomfortable awareness. Their words, once familiar and comfortable, now felt like sandpaper against his conscience. He wanted to say something, to challenge their assumptions like Leslie would, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there, silent and conflicted, realizing that sometimes the hardest truths to face were the ones closest to home. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Leslie stood before the group, her gentle smile unwavering. The afternoon sun filtered through the community center's windows, casting a warm glow across the circle of participants. "Today," Leslie announced, "we're going to do something different. I want each of you to share a moment when you felt powerless, when life seemed unfair." Mark's jaw tightened. He crossed his arms, creating a barrier between himself and the group. One by one, others shared their stories, raw, honest accounts that filled the room with a heavy silence. When Leslie's eyes met his, Mark shook his head. "I'm just here to observe," he said firmly. "Everyone participates, Officer Harrington," Leslie replied softly. "Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is show our vulnerability." Mark felt the familiar surge of defensiveness rise in his chest, but something in Leslie's patient gaze made him pause. He thought about leaving, about maintaining the walls he'd built so carefully over the years. Instead, he found himself speaking. I was 12, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. My dad lost his job. We lost our house. He swallowed hard, surprised by how the memory still stung. We lived in our car for 3 months. I remember how people looked at us, like we were nothing. The words tumbled out now, breaking through years of carefully maintained control. I swore I'd never be powerless again. That's why I became a cop. To have control, to... He stopped, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. To make sure no one could make you feel small again? Leslie finished gently. Mark looked up, meeting her understanding gaze. His throat felt tight. Maybe that's why He couldn't finish the sentence, but the truth of it resonated within him. All these years of rigid authority, of maintaining strict control, they weren't about justice or doing his job. They were about that 12-year-old boy who'd felt helpless and afraid. Thank you for sharing that, Mark, Leslie said quietly. Sometimes the very things we think make us strong are actually shields we've built to protect our wounds. Mark sat back, feeling strangely lighter yet more vulnerable than he had in years. The walls he'd built so carefully were beginning to crumble, and for the first time he wasn't sure if that was such a bad thing. The precinct hummed with its usual afternoon activity as Mark made his way to Chief Ramirez's office. His footsteps felt heavy, matching the weight in his chest. Through the glass walls, he could see the chief reviewing documents at his desk. "Come in, Harrington," Chief Ramirez called out, gesturing to the chair across from him. Mark sat down, his posture stiff and defensive. The chief studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "How are the sessions going?" Ramirez asked, leaning forward slightly. "Fine," Mark replied curtly. "I'm doing what's required." Chief Ramirez shook his head. "This isn't about checking boxes, Mark. It's about growth, about seeing the people we serve as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles." Something inside Mark snapped. "With all due respect, sir, I became an officer to enforce the law, not to hold hands and share feelings." His voice came out sharper than intended, surprising even himself with its intensity. "And how's that working out for you?" Ramirez's question was gentle but direct. "That woman you pulled over, Leslie, she wasn't just a suspicious vehicle or a potential threat. She was a person, Mark. A human being with dignity, with a life story you never bothered to consider." Mark felt his hands curl into fists in his lap. The anger bubbling up inside him felt foreign, almost scary. It wasn't directed at the chief, or even at Leslie. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. "I've always done my job by the book," Mark said, his voice tight. "The book isn't everything, son," Ramirez replied. "Sometimes being a good officer means looking beyond the rules to see the humanity in front of us. That's not weakness, it's wisdom." Mark sat there, feeling the walls he'd built around his emotions start to crack. Years of training, of being told that authority meant maintaining distance, of equating strength with stoicism. It all suddenly felt suffocating. "I don't..." Mark started, then stopped, struggling to find the words. "I don't know how to be any other way." Chief Ramirez's expression softened. "That's exactly why you're in these sessions. Learning to balance authority with empathy isn't easy, but it's necessary. We can't protect and serve if we've forgotten how to connect with the people we're protecting." The words hit Mark like a physical force. He felt exposed, as if the chief had peered straight through his carefully constructed facade to see the confusion and fear underneath. "Your next session is this afternoon, isn't it?" Ramirez asked. Mark nodded, already dreading what new revelations awaited him. "Go in with an open mind," the chief advised. "Sometimes our strongest moments come when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable." Mark sat in the empathy session, his usual rigid posture softening as he listened to a young man named Derek share his story. Derek spoke about being followed in stores, about teaching his children how to act around police officers, about the constant weight of others' suspicions. For the first time, Mark didn't immediately jump to defensive thoughts or explanations. Instead, he found himself picturing Derek's children, innocent and afraid, being taught lessons no child should have to learn. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar ache. When Derek finished speaking, Mark surprised himself by raising his hand. "Can I..." He paused, clearing his throat. "Can I ask you something?" Leslie nodded encouragingly, her eyes warm and attentive. "How do you deal with it?" Mark asked Derek. "The constant pressure of being viewed that way?" The question came from a place of genuine curiosity, not challenge. Derek seemed taken aback by Mark's sincerity, sharing a quick glance with Leslie before responding. "It's exhausting," Derek admitted, "but we find strength in our community, in sharing our stories, in hoping for change." Mark turned to Leslie, seeing her in a new light. He remembered their encounter on that fateful night, how she had maintained her dignity despite his actions. Now he understood. Her strength wasn't defiance as he'd assumed, but resilience born from years of similar experiences. "I think I'm starting to understand," Mark said quietly. "Leslie, when you said you hoped I'd see what I was doing, you weren't just talking about that moment, were you?" Leslie's face softened. "No, Mark, I wasn't. I was hoping you'd see the bigger picture. How single actions like that contribute to a lifetime of hurt for people in our community." Mark nodded slowly, feeling the last of his defensive walls crumbling. "I want to learn more," he said, his voice steady despite his vulnerability. "About your experiences, about how to do better. I've been so focused on enforcing the law that I forgot about protecting people, all people." The room fell silent, the weight of Mark's transformation hanging in the air. Other participants exchanged meaningful looks, recognizing the significance of this moment. "That's why we're here," Leslie replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Not to shame or blame, but to grow together, to build understanding." For the first time since starting the program, Mark felt something shift inside him. Not just intellectual understanding, but emotional connection. He looked around the room at the faces of his fellow participants, no longer seeing them as adversaries or critics, but as teachers, each with valuable lessons to share. A week later, the community center buzzed with activity as volunteers set up tables and hung decorations for the upcoming Youth Mentorship Fair. Mark stood near the entrance, feeling out of place in his casual clothes instead of his uniform. His hands fidgeted with the name tag Leslie had given him. Several people cast suspicious glances his way. They clearly remembered him from the viral video of Leslie's arrest. A mother pulled her child closer as they walked past him. Mark felt the sting of their reactions but understood them. He took a deep breath, remembering what he'd learned about humility in the empathy sessions. "Mark, could you help stack these boxes in the storage room?" Leslie called out, gesturing to a pile of donations. "Of course," he replied, grateful for the task. As he worked quietly in the background, Mark noticed how Leslie interacted with everyone. Her warm greetings, her attentive listening, the way she made each person feel valued. He tried to mirror her approach, offering gentle smiles and respectful nods to those who passed by. Hours went by as Mark moved from task to task, arranging chairs, helping elderly participants find seats, cleaning up spills. He didn't try to draw attention or explain himself. Instead, he focused on being useful, on serving others without expecting recognition. A teenage volunteer dropped a stack of flyers and Mark rushed to help her gather them. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his eyes with surprise at his kindness. "Happy to help," he responded simply, handling the papers with care. By mid-afternoon, Mark noticed subtle changes in how people responded to him. The initial tension began to ease. A few volunteers even started including him in their conversations during water breaks. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Thompson, shared stories about the neighborhood's history while they arranged refreshments together. "You know," Mr. Thompson said, "it takes courage to show up where you know you might not be welcome, but it takes even more courage to stay and do the work quietly." Mark felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm learning that service is its own kind of strength," he admitted. "Different from what I used to think strength meant." Leslie overheard this exchange and gave Mark an approving nod. She didn't need to say anything. Her smile conveyed what words couldn't. Mark realized that this simple day of service had taught him more about true authority than years of wielding his badge. Real power, he was beginning to understand, came not from control, but from caring. As the mentorship fair continued, Mark noticed a family hovering uncertainly near the resource tables. A tired-looking mother clutched a stack of papers while trying to manage 3 young children. The oldest, a boy around 10, kept his eyes downcast, while his younger siblings squirmed restlessly. Leslie approached them with a gentle smile. "Welcome," she said, kneeling to meet the youngest child's eye level. "I'm Leslie. Would you like some juice and cookies while your mom and I talk?" The mother's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I don't want to be a bother," she whispered. We're having trouble with after-school care, and I heard there might be programs." "You're not a bother at all," Leslie assured her, guiding the family to a quiet corner. She pulled up chairs and handed each child a cookie from a nearby refreshment table. Mark watched as she listened intently to the mother's story about working 2 jobs and struggling to find affordable childcare. Instead of overwhelming the mother with forms or quick solutions, Leslie took her time. She explained various programs clearly, answering questions with patience. When the youngest child spilled his juice, Leslie simply grabbed paper towels and cleaned it up, continuing the conversation without missing a beat. Mark found himself moved by the scene. He remembered times he'd encountered similar situations on patrol, frustrated parents, restless children, and how he'd viewed them with judgment rather than understanding. Watching Leslie now, he saw how her compassion created a space where this family could feel safe and supported. The oldest boy eventually began to open up, mentioning his interest in science. Leslie's face lit up as she told him about the center's upcoming STEM program. "We could use a bright mind like yours," she said, and the boy's shy smile transformed his whole face. Something shifted in Mark's chest as he observed this interaction. He thought about all the times he'd had the power to help but had chosen authority over kindness. Now, watching Leslie work with this family, he saw what real service looked like, not enforcing rules but lifting people up. For the first time since the incident that led to his suspension, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. If he could learn to approach people with this kind of patience and understanding, maybe he could become the kind of officer his community needed. The path to redemption wasn't just about completing a program or checking boxes. It was about fundamentally changing how he saw and treated others. As the family left with resources and renewed confidence, Mark caught Leslie's eye across the room. She gave him a small nod, and he nodded back, feeling the weight of this moment. He understood now that true change was possible, not through grand gestures but through small acts of kindness and understanding, one interaction at a time. In the familiar room where his journey had begun, Mark sat among the circle of participants for their final session. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow that matched the atmosphere of trust they'd built over the weeks. His hands were slightly shaky, his heart beating faster than usual. "I'd like to share something," Mark said, his voice quieter than his usual authoritative tone. The room fell silent, and he could feel everyone's eyes on him. "When I first came here, I was angry. I thought I was being punished for just doing my job." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I was wrong. That afternoon with Leslie..." He turned to meet her gentle gaze. "I wasn't protecting anyone. I was acting out of bias and pride, and it wasn't the first time." Mark's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've spent years thinking that being tough meant being right, that showing any softness meant weakness. But sitting here, listening to all of you," he gestured around the circle, "you've shown me what real strength looks like."
Yep.
Tears welled in his eyes, something that would have mortified him weeks ago. Now he let them fall. "I'm sorry. To Leslie, to everyone I've hurt with my actions and attitudes. I know now that being a good officer isn't about power. It's about serving and protecting everyone equally and with dignity." A woman across the circle wiped her eyes and nodded encouragingly. Others murmured supportive words. The atmosphere in the room was thick with emotion but free of judgment. Leslie leaned forward in her chair. "Thank you, Mark," she said softly. "What you've shared takes real courage. We've all witnessed your journey here, and your growth is genuine." She smiled warmly. "This work isn't easy, but you've shown that change is possible when we open our hearts to understanding. Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not the full burden of his past actions, but the crushing pressure of denial and defensiveness he'd carried for so long. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as the tough officer or the man who needed to be reformed, but as someone learning and growing. Around the circle, others began sharing how his words had touched them. One man spoke about his own journey of confronting prejudices. Another thanked Mark for his honesty. The support wasn't earned through authority or intimidation, but through vulnerability and truth. Chief Ramirez sat behind his desk reviewing a folder filled with reports and feedback about Mark's progress. The morning light filtered through the blinds, creating strips of warmth across the office. Mark sat across from him, his posture different from the defensive stance he'd shown weeks ago. "Officer Harrington," Ramirez began, closing the folder. "I've been keeping a close eye on your journey through this program." He leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "The feedback from Leslie has been remarkable, but more importantly, I've noticed the changes myself." Mark nodded, his hands relaxed in his lap. "It's been eye-opening, sir." "I saw you at the community event last weekend," Ramirez continued. "There was a time when you would have stood apart, badge first, person second. But you were there, helping that elderly woman with her groceries, talking with the kids. That's the kind of officer we need." A small smile crossed Mark's face, but Ramirez's expression grew more serious. "However, I need to be clear about something. Your future with this department isn't just about completing this program. It's about continuing what you've learned." Ramirez stood up and walked to the window. "Every interaction, every traffic stop, every call, I expect to see this same level of empathy and understanding. Being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about building trust, showing compassion, and treating everyone with dignity." "I understand, sir," Mark replied, his voice steady and sincere. "Do you?" Ramirez turned back to face him. "Because this isn't optional, Mark. The department is changing. We need officers who can connect with our community, who can de-escalate situations through understanding rather than force. Your technical skills were never in question, but this..." He tapped the folder on his desk. "This growth in emotional intelligence and empathy, this is what will determine your future here." Mark sat straighter in his chair. "Chief Ramirez, what I've learned, it's not just about keeping my job anymore. I see things differently now. Every person I interact with has a story, a life. I can't unknow that." Ramirez nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Good, because that's exactly what I needed to hear. Your suspension will be lifted, but you'll be partnered with officers who exemplify these qualities. I expect you to continue attending community events to keep building bridges with the people you serve." After his meeting with Chief Ramirez, Mark found Leslie in the community center where she often worked. She sat at a desk near a window, sorting through papers for her next empathy training session. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the room, making the moment feel somehow more significant. Mark hesitated at the doorway, his heart pounding. This wasn't like the confrontational officer he used to be. Now he felt vulnerable, humbled. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly on the open door. Leslie looked up, her expression welcoming. "Officer Harrington, come in." He stepped inside, his hands clasped in front of him. "I needed to speak with you, if you have a moment." "Of course." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. Mark sat down, struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking about that night, about how I treated you." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I was wrong, completely wrong. Not just in my actions, but in my entire way of thinking." Leslie set down her papers, giving him her full attention. "You could have treated me with the same contempt I showed you," Mark continued. "Instead, you chose to teach me, to help me see beyond my prejudices. I'm truly sorry for the hurt I caused you that night, and for all the times I've let my bias affect how I treated others." Tears welled in his eyes, surprising him. "Thank you for giving me the chance to change, for showing me what real strength looks like." Leslie's eyes softened with compassion. "Change isn't easy, Officer Harrington. It takes courage to confront our own biases, and even more courage to admit them openly. She leaned forward slightly. This journey doesn't end here. It's ongoing. But every step you take toward understanding and empathy is worth celebrating. Mark nodded, wiping quickly at his eyes. I know I have a lot more to learn. We all do, Leslie replied gently. That's what makes us human. Mark shifted in his chair, a new sense of purpose filling him. You know, Leslie, I keep thinking about how many other officers could benefit from what I've learned here. Leslie's eyes lit up with interest. What are you imagining? Maybe we could create something permanent, Mark suggested, his voice growing animated. A program that brings officers and community members together, like what you did with me, but on a larger scale. Leslie pulled out a notepad, her movements quick with enthusiasm. Tell me more. Well, what if we had regular meetings, kind of like your empathy sessions, but specifically designed for law enforcement? Mark leaned forward, his hands moving as he spoke. We could have community members share their experiences, their fears, their hopes, help officers see beyond the badge and uniform. And beyond stereotypes, Leslie added softly, writing notes. We could include practical exercises, real-world scenarios. Mark nodded eagerly. Exactly, and maybe I could help lead some sessions, share my story? His voice held a touch of uncertainty. I mean, other officers might listen better to someone who's been in their shoes. That's brilliant, Mark, Leslie said warmly. Your journey could be powerful testimony to the importance of this work. They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas. Mark suggested monthly community forums where officers could meet residents in casual settings. Leslie proposed regular sensitivity training sessions that would pair officers with community members for ongoing dialogue. We could call it Bridge the Gap, Leslie suggested, writing the name at the top of her growing list. Perfect, Mark agreed. And we need to make it mandatory for new recruits. Start them off right from the beginning. Leslie smiled at his enthusiasm. We'll need to present this to Chief Ramirez, get official backing. I'll talk to him, Mark said firmly. He's seen my transformation firsthand, and honestly, he paused, choosing his words carefully. The department needs this. We need to do better. You've come so far, Leslie observed, genuine pride in her voice. From resisting these sessions to advocating for them. Mark felt a flush of emotion. Because they work. Because you showed me how to be both strong and compassionate. Other officers need to understand that empathy doesn't make us weak. It makes us better at our jobs. Together, they outlined a comprehensive program, weekly training sessions, community outreach events, and a mentorship system pairing experienced officers who'd completed the program with newer participants. Mark even suggested creating a special unit dedicated to community relations, with officers specifically trained in conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity. 6 months after launching Bridge the Gap, Mark stood before a group of officers in the precinct's training room, the same room where he'd once rolled his eyes at the mere mention of sensitivity training. Look, I get it, he said, recognizing the skeptical faces before him. I was exactly where you are. Thought empathy was just a fancy word for being soft. He paced slowly, making eye contact with each officer. But here's what I learned. Understanding our community makes us better cops. Officer Santos, a rookie known for his tough stance, crossed his arms. With all due respect, sir, isn't this just PR stuff? Mark smiled, remembering his own similar words. Let me tell you about last week's domestic disturbance call. He described how his new approach had diffused a tense situation without force. Because I took time to listen, really listen, we got that family the help they needed instead of just making arrests. The room grew quieter as Mark shared more examples. He noticed Officer Chen, usually quiet during these sessions, leaning forward with interest. You know what changed for me? Mark continued. I realized being tough and being compassionate aren't opposites. They're partners. He pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with his colleagues. When people trust us, they work with us. When they work with us, we all go home safer. After the session, Officer Chen approached him. That situation you described, I had something similar last shift. Maybe we could talk about different approaches. Mark felt a surge of satisfaction. This was how change happened. One conversation, one officer at a time. He'd gone from being the department's cautionary tale to someone others sought out for guidance. The transformation still amazed him. "Let's grab coffee," he told Chen. "I'd love to hear your thoughts." After a few weeks, the community center buzzed with excitement as people filed in for the Unity in Action celebration. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the aroma of shared meals filled the air. Mark stood near the podium, adjusting his tie nervously while watching Leslie greet attendees with her characteristic warmth. When it was his turn to speak, Mark's hands trembled slightly as he approached the microphone. The room fell silent and he could see familiar faces from his empathy training sessions, mixed with community members and fellow officers. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I was a different person. I wore my badge like armor, thinking it made me untouchable. He paused, meeting Leslie's encouraging gaze. Then I met someone who showed me what real strength looks like. Mark gestured toward Leslie and the crowd applauded. This woman, who had every right to be angry with me, chose to teach instead of condemn. Her courage to face me day after day, her patience to guide me through my own prejudices, it changed everything. As he spoke, Mark noticed several people wiping tears from their eyes. Even some of his fellow officers looked moved. Leslie taught me that true authority comes from understanding, not fear. That compassion isn't weakness. It's the hardest kind of strength there is. Looking around the room, Mark saw elderly couples holding hands, young children sitting cross-legged on the floor, and people from all walks of life coming together. His chest tightened with emotion as he realized how much richer his life had become since opening his heart to change. This journey isn't over, he continued, his voice thick with feeling. Every day I learned something new about empathy, about listening, about being better than I was yesterday. And I'm grateful, so grateful, for this second chance. As applause filled the room, Mark caught sight of familiar faces from his empathy sessions nodding in approval. Some were people whose stories had first cracked his defensive shell. Others were community members who had initially regarded him with suspicion but now offered genuine smiles. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Mark and Leslie, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.